For most people, Rome's rise feels inevitable. The legions, the discipline, the roads stretching across continents. It all seems like the natural unfolding of an empire destined to dominate the Mediterranean. But history is far less obedient than that. Empires don't rise because they're chosen. They rise because their rivals fail. And before Rome became the master of the Mediterranean, it stood in the shadow of a very different kind of superpower. A city that didn't build an empire through conquest, but through commerce. A city that didn't rely on legions, but on capital. A city that challenged Rome not with ideology, but with economics. And for a moment, it looked like it might win. Welcome to the Rational Wisdom Lab, where money, power, and history collide, and nothing is ever as simple as it looks. To understand how Carthage nearly stopped Rome, you have to forget the way ancient history is usually taught. Rome is framed as the pinnacle of order and civilization. Carthage is often reduced to a footnote, a wealthy trading power that produced one legendary general and then vanished. But that version misses the point entirely. Carthage was the first great economic rival Rome ever faced, and its power didn't come from gladiators or heroes. It came from something far more modern: trade networks, financial innovation, global supply chains, and a political elite that operated like the board of a multinational corporation. Long before Venice, long before Amsterdam, long before Wall Street, Carthage was building a commercial empire that turned the Mediterranean into its marketplace. Founded by Phoenician settlers from Tyre around 814 BCE, Carthage began as a trading outpost that grew into a powerhouse by mastering three things: the sea, commerce, and logistics. Unlike Rome, which expanded by conquering land, Carthage expanded by controlling choke points: Sicily, Sardinia, Corsica, the North African coast, and eventually the mineral-rich territories of Spain. Carthage didn't need vast farmland or legions of citizen soldiers. It had harbors, shipyards, merchants, and capital. The city's double harbor, a larger outer port for trade and a circular inner harbor for the navy, was a technological marvel. At its center stood an island-shaped admiralty ringed with ship sheds, allowing Carthage to deploy or repair fleets faster than any rival. This wasn't just a port. It was an engine of economic power. Rome, by contrast, began as a landlocked agrarian society whose wealth came from farming and whose military strength came from its citizens. Its economy was simpler, slower, and far more local. In the early centuries, Rome had little interest in naval warfare or commerce-heavy expansion. It was a land empire in the making, not a maritime one. And as long as Rome stayed on land and Carthage stayed at sea, both worlds could coexist. But the Mediterranean is not a place built for coexistence. It's built for competition. Eventually, competition erupted into what we now call the Punic Wars. 3 long, brutal conflicts fought over money, markets, and maritime influence. At their core, these wars weren't about culture or ideology. They were about economic systems. One side built power through land and manpower, the other through trade and capital. When two rising economies tried to dominate the same trade routes, conflict became a matter of arithmetic, not hatred. And everything changed when both powers reached for the same prize: Sicily. Sicily wasn't just another island. It was the gateway to maritime trade routes, a crossroads of grain supplies, and the hinge between the Western and Eastern Mediterranean. Control Sicily, and you control the economic arteries of the ancient world. Rome wanted security. Carthage wanted revenue. And when two rising powers want the same thing, war becomes less a question of ideology and more a question of timing. The First Punic War erupted not because the two civilizations hated each other, but because they shared the same strategic instinct. Whoever held Sicily would shape the balance of power. Carthage entered the conflict as the experienced naval hegemon, confident in its fleets and mercenary forces. Rome entered as a complete amateur at sea. But here is where the financial story begins to diverge. Rome, recognizing its weakness, didn't hesitate to innovate. It copied a Carthaginian warship, built hundreds of replicas, and financed a naval buildup through loans and public contributions unprecedented in Roman history. Carthage relied on its established strengths. Rome created new ones. The conflict wasn't just a fight for territory. It was a clash between a commercial economic system and a militarized financial system learning to leverage credit. To understand why Carthage was so different, you have to understand its unusual economic model. Rome fought wars with citizens. Carthage fought wars with money. The Carthaginian military was largely mercenary-based. Numidian cavalry, Iberian infantry, Berber slingers, Greek specialists. Carthage paid for talent, expertise, and adaptability. It treated warfare like a commercial venture, and as long as its treasury was full, the system worked remarkably well. Carthage could project power across oceans without conscripting its population or disrupting its economic base. Trade kept flowing even during conflict. Merchants continued accumulating wealth, and the city taxed shipping while extracting tribute from client cities. But every economic model has a flaw. Carthage's flaw was structural, a reliance on capital rather than cohesion. If the money ran out, the soldiers ran away. Rome's soldiers were loyal citizens. Rome's strength increased with hardship. Carthage's deteriorated when payments faltered. After its defeat in the First Punic War, Carthage went bankrupt trying to pay mercenary wages. The mercenary war that followed was one of the most brutal conflicts in ancient history. Not because Carthage's enemies were powerful, but because its financial model collapsed under stress. A war born from credit ended in rebellion, born from unpaid invoices. Yet, Carthage did something extraordinary. It rebuilt its economy through innovation rather than surrender. Hamilcar Barca, father of the legendary Hannibal, pivoted Carthage's strategy toward Spain, where silver mines offered a new financial foundation. The Barcid family operated like a sovereign corporation, using Spanish wealth to rebuild military strength without relying on the city's fragile politics. It was corporate financing centuries before the term existed. And then came Hannibal. Most people know him as a brilliant military commander, but in this narrative, his importance isn't just military, it's financial. Hannibal was the embodiment of Carthage's economic model, an executive general commanding a multinational army, paid with Spanish silver, supplied through vast trade networks, designed to break Rome's economy, not just its armies. His campaign became legendary not only because he crossed the Alps with elephants, but because he nearly collapsed Rome's alliances, disrupted its tax base, and threatened the Republic's financial stability. Hannibal wasn't just a commander. He was Carthage's economic strategy made flesh. That's when Rome realized the truth. Carthage wasn't just a military rival. It was an economic one. Rome wasn't only fighting soldiers. It was fighting a commercial empire that could generate capital faster than Rome could mobilize troops. Hannibal's campaign in Italy wasn't about winning battles. It was about breaking Rome's alliances, disrupting its revenue, and shattering economic confidence. In modern terms, Hannibal waged financial attrition. And yet Rome adapted again. It learned to borrow, raise taxes, nationalize land, and sell public property. Rome, under pressure, built the foundations of the financial state that would eventually dominate the Mediterranean. Carthage forced Rome to evolve economically, institutionally, and strategically. In a sense, Carthage made Rome Rome. As the Second Punic War unfolded, the Mediterranean became a laboratory for two competing economic models. Carthage relied on liquidity, its ability to pay, hire, and maneuver. Rome relied on solvency, its ability to mobilize, endure, and borrow. Liquidity delivers early victories, but solvency wins the long game. Hannibal understood the asymmetry. He marched into Italy to destabilize Rome's economy, shatter alliances, and force dependent states to defect. If Rome's tax base collapsed, so would its credit. But Carthage underestimated a principle that would later define the Roman Empire. Rome could survive losses that would destroy other states. When Hannibal annihilated tens of thousands of Roman soldiers at Cannae, Rome didn't collapse. It raised new armies. When Italian cities defected, Rome tightened its grip. When tax revenues plunged, it borrowed from aristocrats who staked personal fortunes on the Republic's survival. It was economic patriotism at a scale Carthage could not match. Not because Carthaginians were less loyal, but because their political and financial systems were built for trade, not total war. Carthage had merchants. Rome had mobilization. Meanwhile, Carthage's elite hesitated to fully support Hannibal. The merchant oligarchy, wary of disrupting trade and losing revenue, refused consistent reinforcements. Hannibal faced a structural disadvantage, a state united by citizenship versus a commercial empire divided by profit centers. In a contest of attrition, that difference is fatal. Rome's response was an economic counterattack. It shifted the war to Spain and North Africa, aiming to cut off Carthage's revenue. Scipio Africanus captured New Carthage, not just territory, but supply depots, treasury stores, and communication networks. Carthage's assets were no longer safe. Its revenue streams compromised, its strategic flexibility collapsing. By Zama, Carthage entered the battlefield financially drained. Rome's victory wasn't just military, it was economic. Carthage's defeat in the Second Punic War led to decades of financial suffocation. Rome imposed indemnities that transformed Carthage from a commercial superpower into a wealthy but restricted city-state. And yet Carthage rebuilt through agriculture, manufacturing, and trade. By the mid-2nd century BCE, it was prosperous again, enough that Roman senators grew alarmed. Their fear wasn't military, it was economic. Cato the Elder ended speeches with "Carthage must be destroyed," not because of armies, but relevance. The final destruction in 146 BCE wasn't just a war crime. It was a financial elimination. Carthage challenged Rome with economics alone. Rome responded by reinventing its own economic system. The vanquished became the blueprint. The victor absorbed the lessons. History doesn't repeat, but if you ignore it, it can crush you. Carthage taught Rome the value of naval power, credit mechanisms, foreign campaigning, and economic flexibility. Rome, in defeating Carthage, became the student of the vanquished. And the uncomfortable truth remains. Economic systems don't just compete. They merge, evolve, and override each other. Carthage lost the war, but Rome inherited its world.